welcome to another episode of Mental Health Monday. Phil, thanks so much for joining me as usual.
Yeah, man.
Can't wait till we were just talking about maybe doing this in person one of these days. That got me excited.
I know.
But so I'm gonna kind of be quick because today's a special day. A lot of you may have already seen at 7 o'clock tonight. So in just about an hour, there's going to be a live conversation on our Facebook page, trying to deal with, kind of what it looks like to have a conversation about racial reconciliation in our country, in the church, even in our small groups. So a lot of ways it's going to look the same for us, Phil. Today we said we were going to talk about what it's like to come alongside someone and grieve. And I think it's just beautiful the way the Spirit sometimes sets things up. Last week we talked a lot about death, but I think today, given what our country is going through and what we're seeing, if we could look through the lens today of maybe what it's like to come alongside our brothers and sisters of color and kind of grieve a lot of their historical heartaches, and even just what's going on today. How do we, in their grief, how do we be better listeners? How do we be better helpers? What is that, and what that looks like? So I hope everyone's ready. Phil, would you mind just kicking us off with a little prayer?
I'd love to. Lord, we believe with all of our hearts that you hear us, that you are here, that you have risen and are using your people, the body of Christ, the church. Lord, that you are ushering in your kingdom. Lord, that you are the one person, the one true God who has the power to actually make right what's wrong. That you are moving all things towards a full reconciliation, a full redemption, where there is no longer any injustice, no longer any hatred, no longer any pain, where you will wipe every tear from our eye, where death will be no more. And Lord, we place our hope in you, knowing that that you know how to bring justice, that you know how to make things right. You know the timing of it. So Lord, help us to surrender today, Lord, to your Spirit. Would you lead this time? Would you govern this conversation with Matt and myself, Lord, helping us to get out of the way of where your Spirit wants to go. And Lord, would you take the reins in Jesus' name? Amen.
Amen. So we'll probably have another week where we do a lot of crying, but it feels appropriate at this point to be brokenhearted. I think we talked a lot last week about how Jesus wept for and with his people, and it's not lost on me that we're just over and over and over kind of taken out of our very comfortable existence, kind of as middle class white people in America, in recent days or recent months, given the global pandemic and everything, and the loss that we've all experienced. But now, as our country almost shifts gears into these heightened racial tensions, it feels right as Christians for us to be brokenhearted to see people hurting so much. So, Phil, I don't really have any coy questions to get us started. I wonder if you want to just start talking maybe about what it looks like to be a good friend to someone who is grieving, whether that is dealing with some of these really intricate situations. It might be nice to, with the time that we have left, once we kind of go through that, to talk about maybe some things to avoid. I think walking into a grief situation with a lot of people tends to be a landmine.
Mm.
right? Where you can make a lot of mistakes that might be damaging, you know, and it'd be cool to maybe talk that out a little bit too. So, what do you
Yeah.
think?
Yeah. I don't know if I said this in previous. Have I said what I go through before usually going to visit somebody? Grieving.
No, you didn't mention that.
Okay. I mentioned somewhere else. So typically, let's say I get a call and somebody I know is about to die, or has lost somebody that they love, and either pastorally, clinically, like they're asking, you know, I'm going to visit with them, or somebody, has just recognized a severe illness, or just some of those really heavy, kind of situations. What I usually go through is I find myself as I prepare to get on the road, and as I'm driving, I'll typically go through some form of panic uh, internally as I start to think through, or think like, man, what's the right thing? What's the right thing to say? What's the Bible verse? What do you say? Like, no matter how many of these, like, I have stepped into, I tend to go through this cycle where eventually I snap into this reality of like, stop it, you know, stop it. You'll never have the exact right thing to say. You need to show up, and I'm talking to myself, and you just need to show up and be present and love them. And I'm not saying, there aren't times where you might have a verse or something handy, but honestly, it's like, I need to step into that moment and really try to tune myself to that moment, and just recognize that there might not be anything to say, and I might not have any words to say. And what I need to do is be honest in engaging that moment. And so if I have nothing to say, I think the most appropriate thing to say when I get there is, I have nothing to say. This, or this just sucks, or I'm so sorry. I wish there was something, I could, but to not have the right answer, to admit the failing of words, to just be authentic in that, and to love them, even if I'm clueless, you know, to just be willing to admit, that, but to not avoid, but to show up, to be present, and and available. Um,
It was very interesting to me to go back a couple weeks ago when Steve preached on speech and the tongue, and we're often as humans, kind of confronted with the reality that speech is all at once so powerful, but so shortcoming sometimes, and and that's maybe the strongest thing we can do with our speech is, uh, like you said, acknowledge by being there, acknowledge someone's pain, and then admitting that we don't have the answers, and that's like that weird where speech goes beyond speech, and it almost turns into like laying our ego down, because we
yeah,
being
yeah,
okay admitting that I can't fix this for you, like I
yeah,
can't, but I'm here for you,
right, right. Or just, I have no idea what you're going through right now, or what you must be going through right now. I just, am I willing to hurt with them? Am I willing to understand? Am I willing to, if I can, am I willing to have access to my emotion with them in that moment? Doesn't mean I will have the emotion. That's okay, but um,
Wait, can you explain that to me a little bit? Have access to your emotion.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's part of tuning the instrument. It's a part of empathy. So it's like this idea of attunement
Hmm.
is like walking into a room, and and almost like, I don't play instruments, but if there was a chord, or if there was a particular, note,
Hmm.
or is trying to tune myself to that frequency, or to that chord, it's kind of like walking in, and trying to understand, um, you know, uh, to um, to tune in to the emotion of the room, and to be present for it, and sensitive to it. Um, it's, I mean, an obvious way to think about this or would be, you know, if I walk into a room with mourning people, but with people that are mourning and sad over something, and I'm in a chipper mood, right? Um, I'm not just like, well, I'm me, you're you, and kind of leap like a gazelle
Mhm.
through the room, like, hey, well, what's going on? I've had a great day. How are you?
Yeah.
Oh, that's pretty bad. Ah, man. Like, there's a sense of like, whoa, like, what's the vibe of the room? What's going on here? I'm not saying that internally I need to feel everything somebody else is feeling, but can I be sensitive to, what's going on and kind of tune myself so I'm not, this loud trumpet in a room of, of, you know, whatever, thinking of violins, it's, um,
We'll have to have Josh Gamboa on sometime, and he can tell us about violins and notes and chords.
yeah, yeah.
No, I see what you're saying. The other thing I only asked because it seems like it might be a self-defense kind of tactic if you are, especially in this situation where, um, for me, as a white man, I basically have the opportunity to go from friend to friend to friend to friend to friend to person who are people of color and basically mourn the same thing over and over. I could see it becoming almost like a self-defense tactic to go into that with deadened emotion and like kind of fall into that, like, oh well, I'm here, I'm showing up for them,
Uh,
but like my heart's not breaking every time I'm with them, or like.
yeah. So I think so the empathy piece though, remember, when it comes to empathy, we see with our access to emotion. So we see with our experience. Okay.
Can you say that one more time for me?
Yeah,
With empathy.
with empathy, we see with our access to emotion, we see with our experience, we see with our, you know, there isn't a cerebral, so meaning if I'm not willing to access my own emotion, if I'm not willing to feel sad, I will not see your sadness, right? Because I see through knowing that depth of water. I know what it's like to swim there. I know what it's like to feel that, to feel something like that. I mean, we don't want to go too far. Usually people don't appreciate the phrase or the sentence, I know exactly how you feel. Usually that's met with like, nah, nah, no, you don't. Like, back up, kind of thing. Because you don't ever know exactly how someone else feels. But there's a sense where sadness recognizes sadness, despair recognizes despair, helplessness recognizes helplessness. Injustice recognizes injustice. There's I think, so empathy is it's the willingness to wade into that water with you and potentially allow it to make me feel something. And if, here's the thing, one of the things that you'll notice is, think of the person in your life, like who, I think maybe this was mentioned in a recent sermon about maybe the friendship one, the person who, and I think to myself, like even around, people have done this around my kids and I get kind of defensive about it. If they get like upset or they get, and they're, I have a 13-year-old and then 6'4", and then 2, almost not 1 yet. So, and so my 6 and 4-year-old are coming to my mind, and if they get an injury or a boo-boo or something like that, and they're just crying, I can think of some people that come along and just try to immediately distract them from the emotion, and like, oh, look at this, or isn't this funny, and kind of like get them to laugh at something and really to help them just get out of that mood and into this mood, or they might do the whole look on the bright side, kind of thing. And or even similar to that is like, it could be worse. There are people who, which part of what you can often tell with people who readily kind of jump to this, number one, they probably are really trying to help, um, but they're probably using the tactic they use on themselves because they don't like to feel those things. And so very likely they're giving their best practice to you, which is a really loving thing to do. Um, it might not be an effective one because I think, unfortunately, it's often accidentally dismissive. Um, it's saying, "Ooh, I don't want to hear what you're saying there, and I don't want to feel what you're feeling there, but look at the bird, or
Yeah.
or feel this, don't feel that, feel this," instead of hanging in to say, "Well, hey, that hurt for you, oh, that's." Um,
Well, that's why it's interesting too, right? When you get, I mean, outside of, we're going to kind of bridge a lot of different things.
mhm.
Talking, sorry, I have a dog barking in the background too. But when you start to talk about DBT modalities and even CBT, right, a little bit before you get into that, talking about getting people out of their red zone into their like creative kind of thinking mind, which uses a lot of distraction skills. The first thing that you want to do is validate those feelings and those
Yep,
emotions, right? As like a
exactly.
healthy kind of relationship. It's, you can't just distract. Like
No, no.
distraction without validation is invalidation.
Yeah. So DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, it came up. Marshall Linehan was the originator of that, and it's a very science. There's a lot of research and science backed in their interventions and strategies. I'm a fan of the therapeutic model, and I think one of the things that I appreciate the most about it is it showed evidence, that it's one of the only things that has really shown evidence that you can, in the way that you're there for somebody else, help them to self-soothe, and you can be someone that helps their physiology to calm down. You're not helpless in the posture that you take and the way that you're there for them. Um, and uh, the probably the most essential piece of that is empathy and validation, um, of their experience and what they're going through. And also, one of the probably the most effective parenting mechanism. It's the only research based that I know of parenting style that is proven to minimize future symptoms in children of both what they call internal and external, um, uh, let's say, symptoms. Uh, Dysfunctional symptoms, or things. So externalized would be sexually deviant behavior, you know, or stealing, or fighting, or what have you. And internal would be, anxiety, depression, um, the ones we experience internally. So it's called emotion coaching, right? And emotion coaching has these, if you get practical, these 5 kind of steps. The first 2 are simply having an awareness of another person's emotion. Um, and then the second one would be recognizing. So first one is just recognizing sadness, recognizing subtle and overt forms of, let's say, especially the ones deemed negative emotions: anger, frustration, sadness, embarrassment. Um, you know, and then the second one would be seeing those emotions as opportunities to connect, because people don't get pissed off about what they don't care about. They don't get very upset about what they don't care about. So if you can tune into those things, you can tune into their hearts in ways that give you more access to intimacy than you have in any other. You can't access it except through those mechanisms at times. So the third one is the empathy and validation. Now, people get really locked in here and stuck here oftentimes because I think oftentimes it can feel for people as though empathizing with somebody and validating their experience means I'm agreeing with them. And so they won't allow themselves to say, wow, if I was, so here's the part with empathy and validation. I'm trying to look through your eyes to understand if I was seeing it that way, you know, can I find it feasible to understand why you might feel that way? So based on what you're telling me, so you're saying, so based on how I hear you seeing it, doesn't mean I see it that way. Okay. But I'm going to listen to you despite how I might see it, and hold my own perspective for a moment, you know, and say, well, how are you seeing it? How do you remember? I mean, we know that our memories are faulty, even if we're arguing about the same experience, details, what happened. You know, if we're watching the same crime scene based on emotion, um, you we're gonna the emotion can color how we've seen that event. So you might remember the description of a guy at a crime scene a certain way, and I'm going to remember him differently because the emotion can cause us, and that's proven. Um, you know, so we might remember details differently, but subjective experience, understanding, well, how did you see that, and based on how you're seeing that, how does that make you feel? And trying to say, okay, if can I understand if I was seeing if I was seeing it that way, can I imagine? Does it make sense to feel this way?
Hmm.
If you're seeing it this way, does it make sense to feel that way? Wow, I can understand why if you're seeing it like that, you would feel like that. You know, it's simply tuning in to say, wow, you know. So for you know, for a kid, you know, who gets a little cut on his finger, for example. I mean, we're talking about bigger stuff today, and we want to get there, okay?
Yeah.
But the little cut on his finger, you know, I might know in my head, like in my perspective as an adult, it's a little cut. It's like it'll be fine. Just pay attention to something else, you know. You're good, you know. But for that kid to just in fact, the quickest way to calm a kid's crying, the quickest way usually is to say, "Wow, that hurt for you," you know, man. And because if you don't acknowledge it, here's what's going to happen. If I say, "Hey, you know, when you're gushing blood, come back and sit down," or you know, like, get out there, you're fine, you know, like, you know what's usually going to happen if you push them away? They're going to cry louder. They're going to scream louder until they get acknowledgement for what they're feeling. They're it's going to you're going to what could have been solved at like a 3 out of 10 usually goes to a flip out 9, you know, until they're acknowledged, you know, and then finally when they get a little bit of like, okay, this hurt, yeah, it hurt for me, you know, kind of thing. So it's empathy validation, and then it's helping them name, for a kid, name the feelings. You know, remember when we put words to things,
Mm-hmm.
you know, it helps emotion to cross hemispheres from right side to left hemisphere, you know, into the more uh, where it's more organizational part of the brain to put in a long-term memory. And then, you know, fifth, you know, help empower them to solve their own problem if possible, you know, assuming they have the best solution to their own problem, you know, and then if necessary, ask if they do need help.
What is 5?
Yeah, 5 is when it comes to either with kids anyway, either boundary setting or problem solving. You know, so it's with problem solving, you know, you've gotten to a point of
But you
helping.
had you had said something about having them problem, like,
Yeah, yeah,
that's an important part, I'm assuming, of,
yeah,
you
problem
know, if
solving.
you're
Yeah.
applying this to adults, it's like giving people the freedom to problem solve. Is that kind of what
Yeah,
you're
well,
saying?
as an adult, it really works. I mean, these are for kids, but honestly, it's worked wonders in my marriage, for example. I mean, like these things, you know, my wife and I were reading about this years ago, and felt like, yeah, I mean, this was for kids, but this is so effective for us. It's so helpful. So what it is it's just assuming that the other person has the best solutions to their own problems.
Hmm.
It starts with that assumption, you know, and so it's trying to just help them say, so what, you know, where do you go with this, or what are you thinking about? Um, what were you planning on doing? You know, where do you go from here? You
Yeah.
know, and then if they get stuck, you know, saying, do you, do you want me to give you my opinion before assuming they do? You know, unsolicited. Um,
I
but
think I think the failure to adhere to number 5 in some of these adult situations, right, is where terms like mansplaining or whitesplaining come from,
I've heard
right?
that.
Where it's just like, oh yeah, here I got it. You know, I think I see how that works.
Yeah, but you know, you also see how something where, I mean, I'm heartbroken, man, over. We were just talking about it before, and um, just over what's happened with Floyd, um, and I think what it does, the symbolic. you know, it points to a much larger issue for a lot of people right now. And so we're talking about grief. We're talking about, how to walk alongside somebody, and I think there's a lot to grieve, when it comes to this area. I think I think I've been really challenged to continue to understand and realize my own blind spots in being white and part of the ethnicity that's been in power in this nation, um, and to try to just continue to be a student in this. I want to give a picture for a second. I'm moving a little bit to in one of my classes when I was being trained as a clinician, ethnicity and marriage and family therapy. I went through an event that I think changed my life, changed my perspective in one of my classes. And I went to Nyack College, Alliance over there. And in this particular class, I happened to be one of two white people in a class of maybe 25. The teacher, I think going into this particular class, I remember they were going to talk about white privilege, and they were going to talk about racism. And I remember thinking to myself, and I'm ashamed of this now, but I remember thinking to myself something along the lines of like, well, I should be good, like I'm not, I'm not racist, and I have a lot of Black friends. I have a lot of, non-white friends, and love them. In fact, I think I often feel more comfortable in those environments. My wife as well, with white people, or with, and I think, and this is my mentality, I think, when we're going around, I'm thinking, great, let's talk about this. And, man, I'll never forget it. The teacher had us do this exercise at one point where he said, okay, we're going to get around in a circle. I want you all to tell the story of when you remember when you realized what color you were. And I thought he was joking. I actually thought he was joking. I was like, in my head, I said, well, that's a ridiculous question. What do you mean remember what color I am? Like, I never had that moment, and exactly. We went around that room, man. And like every single person, except for me and the other white girl in the room, had a story of when the exact moment that they remembered that they were not white, and usually because it was met with some form of like resistance or discrimination, or where where it went against the grain of somehow challenged them or made them less privileged or less able to access a right, or where they were treated differently. And the reality is, and we've talked about this, I think, a lot when it comes to, for instance, when we've talked about in a marriage or in a relationship, the challenge and the importance of scanning for the positive in a relationship, and affirming those things that are positive, and why it's so much harder to do that, because unless it causes us pain and resistance, it doesn't stand out. And so the roads that did not have potholes in it, and the roads that did not have, the smooth roads, we go by, we don't remember, we take for granted often, the amount of labor that went into, let's say, this working for me. But, but where I got a flat tire, or the deli I got a bad sandwich and gave me food poisoning, or, where you complain and make my life harder, or where, these things cause us resistance, these things cause us pain, and we remember those things. They have emotional charge to it. And the reality that my color had never caused me delay, had never caused me pain, meant that I never noticed a moment where by the basis of my color, there was a reason for anything. There was a reason. I've been pulled over a lot. I've gotten a lot of tickets. Never have I thought I got pulled over, maybe because there's some suspicion around my color. Um, Never have I've applied for a lot of jobs growing up. Never have I thought to myself, well, it's my last name. They looked at it and they said, that's an Italian last name, like, I don't know about those guys, you know, um, you know, uh, never have I thought or feared that like somebody was going to assume that I was dangerous because of being white. Um, you know, or that if I'm taking a walk in a neighborhood, that somebody's going to say, "Uh-oh, you know, white guy," like coming around. Like, there's just so many ways that um, that I think I'm still learning about, that people go through and experience friction and resistance, and um, that causes them pain, that gives them, and that I don't know, I think about that and I think, wow, how much am I unaware of? Now here's the thing. I go into a class like that, and the reality is I didn't feel, I thought I was good. Like, I kind of knew what I needed to know, because I'm thinking I don't feel negatively towards anybody, or in my mind, I don't think of an equality difference. You know, I think I would treat you the same way, but I'm not recognizing all the ways. Like, I think I literally thought in my,
Well, I think that's one of the things that, not to cut you off, but I think that's one of the things our culture is finally, we're realizing, and I'm not pointing fingers, right? This is myself included. I'm not lifting myself up as successful, but I'm just saying, in reference to grieving, uh, up until, kind of when these conversations happen or we make changes for the positive, it would be the equivalent of walking into, someone grieving the loss of a loved one, right? And then just being like, oh, hey, what's up? Like you had said before, like not being kind of like having that emotional access. And that's, I think, where we need to start, right? Is to not
right.
just, you know be like, oh, well, I don't see color, or this person's just like, they're not my black friend, or they're not my Latino friend, they're just my friend. um I think that there has to, at some point, right, be some acknowledgement, and it doesn't mean all the time, like you're constantly like bringing this up and never having good friendships or good relationships based on other things. But I really think there's a huge part to that emotional access, that you had talked about earlier, where we're starting to come alongside people
Yeah.
and doing this with them. So we had kind of discussed that earlier before we started recording. But
Yeah, and I
that's
think
what
that
you're
lens of
missing. Yeah.
experience, and also the idea, I was thinking about it. One of the things
Hey,
that
just so you know, before you get started, 5 minutes, okay?
sure.
Just, I'm looking at the clock and thinking about this next conversation starting.
One of the things that I think, I was talking with my wife the other day, and just talking about how, on one hand, for instance, like, we've got a lot of like, police officers that go to, that go to emergence, that we love, that we, a lot of people that we know, and I think, and there is, on the surface, a lot of room for people, for example, to kind of take one experience and then make a judgment about police officers, and about black people, or about colored people, or about whatever, race, to kind of make those judgments. And I think to myself, like, for instance, somebody gets an unjust cop, who does something, you know, uh, out of racial prejudice, or, just unjust, whatever, or somebody has one bad experience, maybe they get, mugged or something like that, um, and they just, by a black person, and I think, and they could form a prejudice based on that, right? Now, the big difference in my mind, one of the big differences, and I'm still, gosh, learning so much, even when we think about power, like, I think to myself, but one walks away in handcuffs, and the other one, is judged by people, like, meaning one, uh, there's a sense where we have to think I think about this through, just the lens of like, is one I might be judged by somebody, but does it limit my power, or even put me at risk of being, um, you know, charged with something, or assumed I'm dangerous by by the people in power. So I just think there's a lot to this, where both suck, but both suck, and both are definitely worth understanding, of course. I just think right now when we think about um, anybody grieving, but the situation that we're seeing around us, yeah, like, um, and I think there's much more depth to this as well, like to try and understand and to sit and just like anybody else, the past affects our present. What we've been through affects our present. To try and understand what's going on, what people are going through, what their fears are. Um, you know, to empathize with them, to be patient in that. Not to say that we should, sure, for police officers, or for um, um, you know, but when it comes to this idea of race, why there's so much tension, why there's so much anger, and or why there's so much of a sense that, like, I'm helpless, you won't hear me, um, to try and be present with them and love them, and I love some of the examples that I am seeing by some of the police force, bowing and like kneeling and just saying, asking for forgiveness, or marching with them, or we've got some tremendous examples out there, of this. So I don't know, man. My heart's broken over this, and I'm not trying to be political about it, and I'm not trying to be, although things have to change systemically, although we have to look at wherever there is injustice,
Yeah.
and acknowledge it, So I don't know,
Well,
man.
yeah, I think, we had talked about that earlier too, when it came to speaking up. Even, you and I have both individually, kind of on our own, in our own spaces, whatever that means, on the internet or in personal circles, of kind of sharing more, which has always been very hard for me, to feel like, um, because I never wanted anyone to feel like I was like, kind of jumping on a cause just to be heard myself, or to make a cause my own. But I really do feel like, political isn't the right word, but yeah, it's time to get political. It's time to do what we can to right injustices, and I think what a better people group to do that than people who follow Jesus, right? That are filled with grace and compassion and mercy, and can bring injustice down with those things, filled by the Spirit of God to move forward and really take action. Um, yeah. So
Yeah,
I don't.
I
I
think
mean,
when we think about the kingdom, Matt, and I know we got to wrap up. When we think about the kingdom of God, you know, any sense, we are literally all, I'm not saying that God delights in the difference of color and the difference of expression and the difference of, but I think there are so many, and I think there are so many ways that should be expressed, but one, there will be complete equality, you know, uh, of, of, of those colors and those diversities and those, races. There would be one race, the human race, and I think that is what, wherever we're seeing a deviance from that, you know, is where, yeah, it's our job, I think, is ushering in the kingdom. Your kingdom come, your will be done. To pray for that, and to be a part of that change, and when that's not happening, especially when it's systematic, or when the people in power are trying to hold on to that power, or when it's unequal, or when that is something we should grieve, and it's something we should fight against. And there's a lot of grieving, and I think there's a ton more to this. And I am trying to learn, but I just, in this, but I do think that, the same principles in many respects that would apply to trying to walk alongside somebody grieving, and trying to just be present for them, even if you've never experienced something like what they've gone through, applies to here. And it should be one that where we are trying to lament with them, or trying to grieve with them, and acknowledge what's true about any injustice.
yeah.
So
Yeah. As we wrap up, anybody who's grieving, if you're watching this, but especially again, our brothers and sisters of color, um, we're grieving with you, and we are trying to learn. And to that note too, if we said anything today that you feel like you could correct or put us in a better direction of thinking, or just want to share your own personal experience, feel free to email me.
Yeah.
It's matthew.novak@emergencenj.org. I can pass any notes along to Phil also. But yeah, we want to just continue to learn, and this space on Mondays, has always been dedicated to mental health for as long as we've been doing this. And I think that a lot of this has to deal with just caring for people, um, because we want to care for people because that's what God has called us to do. um, I got a little choked up when I heard you talk about praying for God's kingdom to come, and I don't ever want that to cause people to be lazy or flippant about our time here. Um, but also don't want to lose sight of how amazing it is going to be one day to be one human race, with no tears, with no pain, with no anger. And God, I just can't wait. I can't wait for that. But I'm also so excited to be, kind of on the side that's always going to be fighting for justice, whatever that means. So yeah, I look forward, Phil, as always, to talking about this more. I'm not sure what the next couple of weeks are going to look like for us, but I hope everyone who's watching this now, I hope you stick around for that 7 o'clock conversation that's going to happen tonight. And then, email right in, ask questions about when more of those things are going to happen. Because this is great. And also, I just want to, if you're tuning in today, I just want to thank you again. Um,
Yeah.
we love to get to do this, and we don't, we don't get to do it unless there's people who are here participating and listening. So, leave a comment, drop a note if you have anything you want us to talk about in the future, whether it's stuff related to today or just stuff in regards to, kind of mental health, as we all still are in some type of weird in between global pandemic slash dealing with, kind of national hurts and things like that. So really, we love you, Phil. Man, again, it's my favorite time every week to connect with you. So I'll see you, buddy. Let's
All right.
do a slow
All
high
right.
five.